Good afternoon, guys. So I wanted to pop on here and share some resources with you. So today on my walk, and yes, I walked today out in the rain with my umbrella. But as I've shared with you guys before, that's when I tend to hear the whispers of the Holy Spirit the most. So I started a new book today, and I was listening to it on my walk, and just a thought came to me how many books and podcasts that I've listened to since the beginning of my grief journey. So I kind of wanted to share some of that with you. So I want to preface this by saying when we're grieving, guys, we're in a very vulnerable state of mind, and it's very important what you open your mind up to. Our thought processes are not normal, and they can affect how we process going forward. So let's think about the things we want to put into our minds and hearts that's going to help us grieve in a healthy way. So a couple of things I wanted to share with you. You guys, I've mentioned this before. It's called The Book of Hope. And by the way, I will put all of the books and the authors in the comments, so you don't have to write this down if you're driving and you're listening, or you're busy. You don't have to write this stuff down. So this book, as I mentioned before, The Book of Hope. It's by Nancy Guthrie. She has a very good insight into grief. In fact, she's written several books about grief, but this book in particular. It's named after one of her children. She had two children that passed away due to a genetic disorder. But this is it's kind of a devotion book, so to speak. And it has subjects of grief matter. And I will tell you that in the beginning of my grief journey, I could not focus on anything. I could not think about anything. I really just was... my mental ability to focus was very limited. So this book was really good because I could go to it every day. I could go back to it. It gives scripture references that were helpful for me to look up. So if you're new to grief, this is something that I would highly recommend to use as a companion, because as I mentioned before, I never left the house without it. And also in the Bible, the book of Psalms is very comforting, and I would read those a lot. You know, David, there's some other authors as well that actually wrote in the book of Psalms, but David, he waxes and wanes with his grief, much like we do in our grief journey. So the book of Psalms is a good place to go. And also, you know, the book of Job. I was not able, as I mentioned, to concentrate on anything, but I found comfort in the book of Job because he had gone through something worse than me. I lost one child. He lost all his children and everything. So that was a good place for me to listen to try to get some answers and to be comforted. So I would recommend the book of Job. A podcast that I listened to, if any of you all listened to the interview that I did with Sarah, she mentioned the Nothing is Wasted podcast. And that podcast very much prepared her for our journey as a family. So I had not listened to it, although she had mentioned it to me a couple of times. I had not listened to that before our grief journey began, but I would highly recommend Nothing is Wasted podcast. You can find it on Apple, and if you're Android, I do believe there's a way to listen to it on Android. I'm not exactly sure what platform you go to, but it's very much worth your time. Davey is very solid. His grief journey is really tragic, and out of that came a ministry that he calls Pain to Purpose. So that I would recommend that. He also has an ebook on his site that I read as well. There's other resources on his website as well that I would highly recommend. And if you're new in grief, that is something that you want to find solace in knowing somebody else has walked this journey besides you. And that was one place that I went to be comforted, was to listen to other people's grief journey and learn and listen how they survived. Because, you know, guys, it's about survival. Then a couple of resources, and I'm sorry I'm a little late in the game here, guys, because the holidays are over, but Grief Share has a book called Surviving the Holidays that's very, very good, and I utilized that book our first Christmas without Andrew. Not our very first, because that was actually a month after Andrew passed away, but it was the following Christmas that I utilized that book. And this book was given to me by a member of our church, a very, very dear woman that's had loss, and she gave this to me, When Holidays Hurt, by Bo Stern. And that was also something that helped me as well. I have read many, many books and listened to many, many podcasts. So I don't want to overwhelm you with everything that I've listened to on my grief journey, but I do want to just point out a few other books that have been very instrumental to help me. Now, this is probably not for somebody that's new in your grief journey. This was given to me, actually, it was recommended to me by a therapist, not my personal therapist, but a friend of mine that I know really well, Dr. Norman Wright. He is a grief and trauma counselor. Now, this book covers recovering from losses in life, not just from death. Many of us don't consider other losses sometimes something that we grieve over. However, we do. And he does address this in this book. I focused on the parts that were more pertinent to me at the time, but it's a very good book to read to help guide your journey in a healthy way. Because, guys, I want to mention this to you because couple of the books that I listened to in the very beginning were on heaven. When somebody you love very dearly leave this earth, you want to know what they're doing. You want to know what their life is like, and everything about it that you can find out. And that's very common in somebody who's had loss, especially traumatic loss like we had, a very sudden, without warning. And so there's 2 books on heaven that I listen to. Now, I don't have a physical book to show you because I actually listen to them on Audible. But it's Heaven by Randy Alcorn. And I don't recommend you listen to that on Audible because he gives tons of scripture references, which totally overwhelmed me when I was trying to listen to it on Audible. But the content of the book is very good, and I would recommend that. Some of it is speculation based on his interpretation. So keep that in mind. And then also there's a book by Johnny Erickson Tata, which I listened to not too very long ago. And it's just called Heaven, and it's very good. It's very, very good. I would highly recommend that. And be careful, guys. I've already mentioned this, but we're in a very vulnerable place when we're grieving. Your world's turned upside down, and you might be have not been open to in the spiritual world. And I would just caution you to be very, very careful about that, because you don't want to open yourself up, your mind up to things that might not result in a healthy grief journey for you. Now, there are a couple of other podcasts. One thing I do want to caution you about that I probably erred in this. I was so consumed with my grief that I only listened to things about grief. When you're new in your grief, when you're trying to manage and you're trying to literally get out of the bed every day, that's all you can think about is your grief, and that's okay. That's okay, guys. That's okay. Don't ever find yourself in a place to where you somebody says something to you, or you yourself are feeling any sort of shame or guilt for your grief journey, because that's really not fair. People don't get to comment on your grief journey, because guess what? They have not walked in your shoes. So keep that in mind. Don't ever let anybody shame you or make you feel like that you're not recovering quick enough, because I don't mean this in a mean way, but you know what? They have no idea what they're talking about, and they should not make comments like that. So with that said, I do want to caution you to not spend too much time in your headspace in grief in such a way that it pulls away your ability to function. And by that I mean, as I moved through my grief journey, I started listening to some things that were not necessarily about grief. I could not listen to music. I don't know how your grief journey is, but any kind of music whatsoever was so painful to me that I couldn't do it. I couldn't even listen to praise music. I couldn't. It was just also very, very painful. I couldn't listen to music. So my reprieve was to listen to books or podcasts. A couple of podcasts that are a little on the lighter side. They're not about grief. It's a fairly new podcast. It's Dare to Be. You may be familiar with these ladies. It's Natalie Grant and Charlotte Gamble. They have a ministry, and Natalie Grant, of course, is a well-known speaker or singer, and Charlotte Gamble is. She's the meat. She brings the message, and she's very pleasant to listen to. She's Australian, and I find a lot of solace in listening to these girls. They have a podcast, and it's just called Dare to Be. And it's scripturally based, but it's a little bit on the lighter side. It's not heavy or deep into any sort of religious content. And then as another podcast that, I like to listen to Kane. I don't know if you guys know who she is, but she has a remarkable story. And her journey of using her pain for purpose is absolutely supernatural. And I love listening to her. Now, she's a little on the deeper side spiritually, and she talks fast, and she covers a lot of content, but man, it's packed full of very helpful spiritual content. So I would recommend her. It's just called the Kane Show. So she is found, you can find her on Apple too. Now, a couple of podcasts that I've kind of listened to from not in the very beginning, but after a while, was Bob Goff. I don't know if you are familiar with him, but he is an inspirational speaker, and he is, I really don't know what term to use to describe him. He's risky. His faith is unbelievable. His trust in the Lord is unbelievable, and he takes unbelievable risk because that's how much he trusts in God. But he has a podcast called Dream Big, and I love to listen to people's stories of where they started and where God took them. So that's another podcast that's a little on the lighter side, and it doesn't require a lot of attention focus, which is kind of good because it takes your mind a little bit away from your grief journey and keeps your mind busy, but it doesn't require a lot of heavy thinking. Another podcast that I've just recently started listening to is it's by Wandery. And the one I like is American History Tellers. I love history. So, but there's lots of categories in that Wandery whole podcast that you can listen to. So, if you're not a podcast person, I totally understand that. But pre-COVID, I spent a lot of time on the road. So early in my grief journey, I got back on the road way too soon. Don't underestimate, guys, walking the grief journey and feeling the feelings. I'm a very driven person, and I'm a very task-driven person. And, we had a business, and all I could think about was, I got to work. Don't do that. Allow yourself the time to grieve. Because if you don't grieve now, guys, you will grieve. And it may not be timely when it hits you. So allow yourself that time to grieve. And then I did want to mention a book that helped me be thankful. So one of my very, very first videos that I posted was on how to be thankful. And I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive to a lot of people. When you're grieving, you might say, what do I have to be thankful for? And that's exactly where I lived for a long time. And that part of my grief journey was very difficult for me. But I came to a point to where I realized that I needed to start being thankful for the things in my life that were still in my life. And Sarah and I have talked about this, and she told me, she said, Mom, I remember when you said that. And literally, that's when my grief journey turned around and went from a very, very dark place to a place where I felt like I could see the light of day again. So this book I ordered off Amazon. It's by DC Talk, and it's called The Voice of the Martyrs. Now, this is not light reading. I'll warn you of that ahead of time. However, it helps with perspective. And perspective is everything. And though I felt like I had nothing to be thankful for, this book showed me, yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. You have so much to be thankful for. So, and I haven't read the whole thing, but this sits beside in my sitting room, and when I feel that heaviness coming, sometimes I just pick this book up and I read a story, and it will change the way you feel about what you have to be thankful for. Now, I just started a book today, and this is what made me think of you guys, because when you're grieving, you go to bed tired and you wake up tired. And that's hard to explain. Now, I didn't sleep for almost 18 months, and that's another whole story. I had to get some help for my physical needs. So if I'm speaking to you and you are not able to sleep at night, I will tell you that my internist gave me sleeping pills. It didn't work. I still didn't sleep. I roamed the floors at night for months. And finally, thankfully, my therapist said, you know what, I think, I recommend you seeing a doctor for hormones, because, with my age. And it turns out that was some of the best advice I had ever received, because now I can sleep at night. However, when you're grieving, you can sleep for hours and wake up and still be exhausted, guys. So I've just recently learned of this book, and again, it's an Audible. I'm listening to it on Audible, but I'll share the title with you. It's called Sacred Rest, and it's by Dr. Sandra Dalton. And she is a physician. She's an internist, but she says that there are 7 types of rest. Did you know that? Because I didn't. They're physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, sensory, social, and creative. Now, I just started this book, so I'm just a few hours in. But I am so excited to learn what she's going to teach me about the different types of rest, because sleep is not rest. I know we've all been taught that, but there's a quiz, and I'll post this in the comments too. There's a quiz on her website that you can take that will let you know what areas that you need to improve, or areas that you are lacking in when it comes to rest. And I took that quiz, and I was not surprised at the results, but there are many areas. Almost every one of these, except for spiritual, almost every one of these, I am way below what would be considered normal. So I've got some work to do. And I'm excited about learning everything she has to offer. She is a Christian, and it's a faith-based book. So I'll look forward to maybe sharing some information about that with you later. But I hope that something I said helped. Please share this with your friends, your family, anybody that's grieving, because we need to grieve in a healthy way, guys. Because, I often think of the verse in Philippians. Everybody reads the verse about do not be anxious about anything, but in everything with prayer and supplication present your request to God, and the God of peace, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. But the following verse tells us how to have peace of mind. So I encourage you to look that up, because one of the things that I have learned And she talks about this in the book of Sacred Rest. Mentally is where I struggle the most because my mind never stops. And I am always on the move, and I am always reading and listening to something. And really, the only time my mind really ever stops is when I am walking and I am out there and I'm away from everything. And that's when I hear God the most. But I've learned that mentally my score was so high when I took that quiz because all of the chatter that goes on in my head, and I know you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. When you're grieving, there's a lot of chatter that goes on in your head. And she referenced this verse right out of the gate, and so I was sold because the verse talks about, Paul says what we're supposed to think about, guys. And we think we can't control our thoughts because they're so consuming. But one of the first things he says, there's a whole list, but the first thing he says is think about what is true. Think about what is true. Because, guys, I'm going to tell you something. The enemy is out there. And he is out there and he is trying. The battle is in our minds. I 100% believe that. Our battle is in our minds. And so he tries to convince us of lies. So one of the things that I've learned way before grief, but one of the things that I've learned is that I have to measure my thoughts against the truth. Is this truth or is this a lie? Is this an accusation? Because God don't accuse, guys. He does not accuse. Satan accuses. God gently convicts us. There's a big difference. So I want to encourage you to look up that verse, and if you want peace of mind, read that. What we're supposed to focus on, things that are true. And there's a whole list. Lovely. The things that are honest. Many things that we're supposed to focus on. But truth is the very first one. So that's all I have for you today, guys. I look forward to maybe if you guys are, if you're interested, once I get through this book, I would love to share the knowledge that I've gained from that. But I hope that may give you some things to think about and maybe some resources that might help you grieve healthy in your grief journey. So I look forward to seeing you next time, guys.